Meetings will continue until morale improves. Well, I mean, that's old management style, and it's one way to get people to do things, but it's not the right way and what your audience needs. You deliver it when you said you would, and you get them excited and using the solution, right? Why do people want to use you? Okay, because you can solve the business problems that others can't. Well, you build relationships. You keep your processes simple and effective, and you always deliver on your promise. If you were to say, right, change your email from Gmail to Outlook or vice versa, that isn't going to improve the communication between yourself and your client or within the team.
Well, welcome everyone to today's workshop. And I'd like to introduce today's Paul Fleming. So Paul Fleming, he comes from a very diverse background when you look at his history on LinkedIn. And Washington State University is where he spent a lot of his time. So he comes with a wealth of knowledge. And at the start of 2020, obviously Paul decided to start his own business. And today he's going to come along and talk to us about a range of things. And there were several different ways that you put it on your introduction for today's workshop, Paul. You had like 3 questions or whatever it was, and three solutions.
Yep.
A little bit about that and where it comes from and your expertise in that area.
Yeah, I can. So thanks everyone for coming, and thanks Scotty for having me on here too. This is great. So what I've found is we all get to solve, or we're all asked to solve business problems, right, every day. So sometimes that's solving them within our own business, or say for our clients. And I know from my own experience, right, sometimes we get those right, and there are other times where we just completely miss the boat. And like I said, that's definitely my own experience. And in fact, there's a recent project management survey noted that 2/3 of all the projects that create a solution to solve a problem, like they actually deliver a finished solution, 2/3 of those problems don't provide the benefits that project has promised, right? So basically 2/3 don't solve the problems that they intend to do. And so over the years, I've worked in a lot of places, and Scotty mentioned, right, my higher education experience, but I've also done manufacturing, I've done advertising agencies, and I've also worked in a lot of different jobs too. So I've been a graphic designer, a programmer, project manager, team manager, and client liaison. And so all of that experience has given me a really well-rounded perspective to be able to see projects from all sorts of different angles. And what I've found is there are some common elements, there's a pattern. And when those elements are there, and that's where we're going to get into the questions, right? And the steps to solving those problems. When those elements are there, then our projects and our solutions are going to be successful. And when they're not there, then we're really going to struggle. So what I want to do now is I want to go back sort of in time to imagine, you know, right, kind of like the sort of the wavy lines across the screen. So I want to jump back about 7 to 8 years to a situation that really brought everything together for me, and it helped me see how all the pieces come together. And it was an inspiration for Be Helpful and Encourage Engagement, which is what we're going to talk about. So at the time, like I said, about 7 or 8 years ago, I was working on this massive project. It was very complex. And quite frankly, it was failing. And as the project manager, I'll be honest, not proud of this, but 95% of that failing was on me. And at the same time, I also had to take someone very, very close to me to the hospital's emergency room. And for anybody who's been, you'll know that, I mean, one, your own heart rate's going because it's pretty scary that you've got to be there. But within the hospital ER itself, it's a very chaotic and crazy looking experience because there's people going all around the place. There's all sorts of odd terminology being thrown around. There's a lot of noise. There's all sorts of kind of funky machines. And so to help me kind of not freak out and to not get really stressed out about it, I tried to detach a little bit and see what was going on from a higher level. I actually found that there really is a method to what's going on in that hospital ER. And so the first thing I noticed was the go-to person in the emergency room that we were in. Now, if you'd have asked me before we went into the hospital, I would have said that go-to person was the doctor. But in fact, who it was the senior nurse. And the reason I thought of this is because the nurses all went to him with questions. When the doctor needed to pass on instructions, he did it through the senior nurse. And when the patient and myself needed to know what was going on and we needed updates, they came from the senior nurse. So it's clear, right, that he knew exactly what was going on and what needed to be done. Which then kind of leads me to the second part here, which is that on the wall of the room, they had this massive whiteboard. And on the whiteboard, they had the name of the patient, the doctor, and the senior nurse. But it also had a to-do list with check boxes of, right, the treatment plan, so what needed to be done and when it needed to be done, right? Because obviously taking right, blood pressure and temperature and all that kind of stuff, you've got to do it at set times throughout the visit. And the whole purpose of the whiteboard was to make it clear and easy for everybody in the room to know what was going on, what needed to be done, and if it had been done or not. Now, those two things are great, but there was kind of like a fly in the ointment that stood out to me here. And this was the software that was intended to track the bags of plasma from the lab to the patient. So the idea is you grab a barcode scanner and you scan the wristband on the patient, and then you scan the barcode on the bag of blood. And the software goes, woohoo, everything matches, we're good to go. Well, there was a bit of a problem here because the patient had two wristbands, so that's 2 barcodes. The bag of plasma had 5 barcodes on it, which was a bit crazy. Then you had right, universal O negative going to a patient with A negative blood. And the senior nurse, the software basically just told the senior nurse, now forget it, it was not happening. So it took him 3 escalating service calls before a technician on the end of the phone could remotely tell the software, yeah, you're good to go, right? We'll approve this and move forward. But what was kind of interesting, and that took 20 minutes to go through, but what I found really interesting, and this is a pivotal moment for me, was the senior nurse in the middle of that, he just casually reached over and started the blood transfusion, just manually. And for me, I mean, it's such a classic example of don't forget your end goal, right? No matter what's going on around you, he still had that focus, that treatment. Hey, we've got to do this blood transfusion. The software and all the kind of stuff, yes, it's got to track and approve it, but the key objective here is to do the blood transfusion, and that still happened. So all of those things kind of, they really highlighted for me a different way of leading projects and teams, which is where the problems that I'd fallen into previously. That's right, I had a bad way of leading the teams. Now, I wasn't abusive, but I wasn't particularly motivating or helping people understand what they needed to do. So coming out of that hospital ER, there's a few things that really stood out. So one, obviously, right, building those trusting relationships, super important. Secondly, having a go-to person in the room, absolutely critical. Thirdly, being able to really understand the problem at hand and really defining that. Because obviously in a hospital, right, if you misdiagnose the patient and you give the wrong treatment, you run the risk of, right, but yeah, of right, people dying. I mean, it's, right, you've got to get that right at the beginning. And then not only have you got to get the right treatment plan, but your processes to deliver it have got to be simple and they've got to be repeatable so that it can actually be a successful treatment. And then the final part is that whatever software we're creating or we're using, it should be helpful, right? It should solve the problem that it's designed to do. It shouldn't become a hindrance. It needs to be a help. So those are the big takeaways from there. And so now what I like to do, Scotty, is I want to share the screen because I want to get in and show some of the statistics that highlight the problems when we don't correctly solve our problem right at the beginning. So for example, right, like that plasma tracking software. So do you all see blue background with a couple of Rubik's Cubes on it?
Sure do.
Sweet.
Yep.
So here's a bunch of statistics, right? In my project management background, every project manager has to have a slide with numbers in it. So it's just tradition. So these statistics come from 3 different surveys. So 2 of them are project management based, one's employee engagement, And so I wanted to focus on the big number up in the top right, which is 36% of projects mostly or always deliver their full benefits. Now that 36%, right, I mean, that actually might not sound too bad. But what that's actually saying is that only 1 out of every 3 projects that deliver a solution, that solution is actually correct. Like I said, 2/3 of those projects is pointless, right? They're not delivering the benefits that were expected. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. And so these are the 2 things that the numbers are telling me. So one is that people are struggling to really understand and define the problem at the beginning, so they're not able to deliver the right solution. Or if they do deliver the right solution, at the end of it, they're not helping people get excited and engaged with the project or with the product and understanding how to use it so that they can get the expected benefits and results from it. So of course, the flip side to this, right, is that if your product and service does do what it says on the tin and it does deliver those promised benefits, you're already ahead of 2/3 of your competition, even before you get into your awesome sales and marketing stuff. So the next 2 numbers that I want to look at, these are specific, right, to the actual work that we're doing when we're creating our solution. And these are that 10% of every dollar invested in those projects is wasted. And less than half of our projects are mostly or always completed on budget. And again, if we think about this, it's no surprise, right? Because if we don't understand the problem at hand right at the very beginning, then when we're into the project and we're creating the solution, we're creating the wrong one, which means that we're now having to play catch up. And so we've got constant design changes, we've got scope creep, we've got overruns, and all of those things cost time and money. Which now brings me on to the last statistic here, which is that just over half of workers are not cognitively and emotionally connected to their work and workplace. So basically, kind of like, I mean, that's like 1 in 2 people are like, meh, when it comes to work. And all right, and I've been there, you know, and it's not, it's kind of sad. And reasons being, because you know that the majority of the work that you're doing isn't going to help anybody, right? It isn't going to make a difference, right? Because the 2/3 of the projects that you're doing don't deliver their benefits. Or the other situation is that you're in a broken work environment where the software and the processes that you're using, they don't help you do what you need to do. And so they become a hindrance and not a help. So how do we take advantage of these numbers? What can we learn from them, right? Because these numbers paint a bit of a horror story, right? It's a bit of kind of like thunderstorms and clouds, but there's an opportunity here, which is very much, right, of the rainbow after the storm. So if we think about this, right, the way that you solve problems that others can't is that you understand the business problem, you deliver the right solution when promised, and you help people understand how to get the benefits. So how do we take advantage of this opportunity, right? Well, here's where the be helpful and encourage engagement comes in, and it's a way of thinking. So here's my formal definition for it. So being helpful means that you understand what your clients, your end users and teams need to be successful. And then you use that complete and accurate picture to deliver the right solution when you promised. And people are engaged with it and they keep coming back for more and they're getting the expected benefits and results from it because your product and service is easy to understand and use, it fulfills a need, and it's memorable. So this is the goal, right? Our end goal of having a be helpful and encourage engagement mindset. This is what you're going to achieve. That people work with you because they want to, not because they have to. And so a good example of this is, say, for example, right, the big telecom companies. And I bet the ones in Australia and are just as bad as the ones here in the US, right? And the same probably right for the UK and Canada, where their pricing sucks, their plans suck, their contracts suck, their customer service is awful. But we all need our cell phones and our internet connection. So we don't have a choice, right? We have to go with them. But the only way that we ever refer them to, right, to people, right, to family or friends, is because those big telecom companies, they bribe us with discounts or gift cards. So how do we reach this place of nirvana, right, where people want to work with us? Well, we've got 3 steps to do that. So our first step is to take a people first approach. And as my old mentor used to say, people first, policy and process second. Step 2 is to ask 2 strategy and execution questions and then follow through on the answers to those. And then step 3 is to develop a keystone habit. Now we develop that habit, right, by following through on our strategy and execution questions from the behaviors that we develop when we follow through on those questions. So here's step number 1, people first. Now, what do I mean when I say people first? Right, well, really, it's this. It's treating people with respect and building those trusting relationships. Because without that trust and that sense of collaboration and confidence, everything else is going to fail. And those are the things that's absolutely foundational. That's what we have to build, right? Because I'm a big believer that it's people that make a difference when it comes to the success and failures of our projects and our solutions. It isn't tools and process. Now, those things help, right? For sure, because we need a structured way to do things and we need to be able to track it. But those tools and processes, they're not the differentiator. They're not going to make the key difference. So if we think about this, if you were to say, right, change your email from Gmail to Outlook or vice versa, that isn't going to improve the communication between yourself and your client or within the team. And again, likewise, if you were in software development or were in manufacturing, adding additional layers of approvals and paperwork isn't going to improve the quality of the end product. What's going to do that is positive behaviors from the people involved. So how do we encourage those positive behaviors? Well, this is where our 2 strategy and execution questions come in, right? Our encourage and barrier questions. Now, I love this slide for a couple of reasons, actually. So one, apart from the fact it's got a dog in the middle, Mia, and look at her, right? I mean, she's sitting there like a good girl, and she's clearly got a very pressing and important question. And we're going to get to Mia's question in a minute. But the other thing that I really like about this slide is the encourage and barrier questions are so powerful. They're the heart, right? I mean, they're the beating heart of be helpful and encourage engagement as a mindset, right? They really are the secret sauce to being able to solve the business problems that others can't. So here are the 2 questions. So how can I encourage people to, and then you insert the desired behavior. And then what barriers do I need to remove for this to happen? So the language here is very important too, because it's all about how can I encourage people, right? And our emphasis there being on encourage people, because remember, right, it's all about people first. People make the difference at the beginning. But another way to think of it too is if you remember that old poster that used to be up on factory walls, or it would be in, right, sort of, right, you know, management offices everywhere, which was, right, the beatings will continue until morale improves. Well, I mean, that's old management style, and it's one way to get people to do things, but it's not the right way. You know, it's all about encouraging those trusting relationships. So let's look at this from Mia's perspective for a minute, right? Because she very clearly has 2 pressing questions. And her 2 very important questions are, how can I encourage my owner to give me more treats? And how can I encourage my owner to give me human bedtime at night? 2 very important questions if you're a dog. So here's our first one when it comes to the treats. So Mia could certainly, right, she could certainly raid the treat jar, and that's going to give her a lot more treats, but it's going to be a one-off occasion and she's going to get into trouble for it afterwards. So what she needs to do is develop, right, some good behaviors that encourage her owner to give her more treats. Now let's think about human bedtime, right? And I've never met a dog who didn't want human bedtime. And so what barriers should she remove for that to happen? Well, a big one, right, is when she's let out at the end of the night, right, for the last run outside at the end of the night before bedtime, is she shouldn't go rolling around in those dirty, muddy puddles, right? That's going to be a big no-no. But I want to talk about and give an example, like a real life example of those encourage and barrier questions. So about 3-4 years ago, the university I was working in, they just bought this massive HR and payroll and finance software. It's humongous. And we needed to build the organization chart. So this is, right, who reports to whom, right, who your boss is and who your boss's boss is and all that kind of stuff. And the org chart was central to the software because what it did is it helped route those electronic forms and making sure that they're going to the right person for the right approval. Now, the university had tried to do this previously, and the person who'd done this had just, all they'd done was create this massive and super complex spreadsheet, and then they'd attached it to an email, sent it out, and went, do this. And all they got was aggro. And they were a bit surprised, right, why they got aggro from it. So they came and tapped me on the shoulder and they went, yeah, that didn't work so well, did it? Can you have a crack? So I took a very different view of this, right? And again, thinking about this people first approach, right? So that one with the email and spreadsheet, that was very much process and tools focused first, right? And people wasn't even on their to-do list, I don't think, right? Whereas my approach was very much people first. So my encouraged questions that I was thinking of were, okay, how can I encourage the managers to give me the data that I needed when I needed it? How could I encourage the managers to see the bigger picture, to see how that software would benefit the whole university? And how could I get the managers to understand that it was okay, or encourage them to work with their fellow managers across the university? Because then when I was looking at the barriers that I needed to remove, one of the barriers was a fear of standardization and centralization, because the colleges are very autonomous for a lot of their things. And so when you start introducing processes and requirements and policies that come out of central, the colleges get very suspicious and their backs go up. And because they're autonomous, they're also not so keen on working with each other. So building those relationships and collaboration, that doesn't always happen, which leads to silos and fiefdoms and also broken promises. So those were the barriers I needed to resolve. So my approach here was to get a working group together of key people from all across the university. So the different colleges, the different locations, and from administration. And I sat them down and I helped them work through and understand why I needed the information when I did. And that started to build those relationships and get people used to collaboration. Because then the next thing I did was to ask them to help me build a spreadsheet that made sense to them and was easy to collect the data that we needed. Because again, right, my driving question here is, how can I encourage the managers to provide the information that I needed? So when we were ready to go, this is where we were at. We were building relationships. Everybody understood why I needed the data and when I needed it. The tool to collect it, the spreadsheet, was easy to use. And not only that, but also the working group, they were able to help me go across the university and to work with all of the managers across those 15,000 employees to build that org chart. So the first time around when they did this, right, they got 25% of the data and, like I said, a whole bunch of aggro. And then when I went through it and did it, I got 95% of the data and a ton of smiles. And so one of the really powerful things that comes from those encouraging the barrier questions is not only do they give you the strategy and the execution, right, what to do and how to do it, but you also start building all of these other behaviors that has this knock-on impact. Because how can I encourage managers to give me the data I needed? Well, now from that, we start building relationships. We're creating easy to use processes, and we're also encouraging collaboration. So we've got these knock-on impacts. And so when you have behaviors that you're doing consistently, that becomes a habit. And when that habit impacts everything else that you're doing, it becomes a keystone habit. So I'll also now show the encourage questions from a business example too here, which is how can I encourage clients to provide an accurate list of the things they need? Well, the answers here are going to be different depending on the industry and the clients they've got. And so, but here for this example, I'm going to say that we've got people-based answers and we've got technical-based answers. And so for our people side, so how can I encourage clients to provide an accurate list of the things they need? Maybe we need to build a trusting relationship. And one of the other things here with the questions is that they're iterative. So we can ask the question, we get an answer, and then we can ask the question again. So how can I encourage myself and my client to build a trusting relationship? We'll show that I listen and follow through on promises made. Well, how can I encourage myself to follow through on promises made? We'll be present and organized, have efficient processes, right, and lead an awesome team. Now, here's our technical answers, because our goal here is to make it easy to collect that data and then easy also to analyze it and to take the next steps with that data. Because again, if we've got that, then we're going to be building that trust and confidence with the client, because they're going to go, you know what you're doing. You're organized. You've got everything in place. This is good. I like this. So now let's look at our keystone habit, right? Because again, right, that keystone habit, this is one that positively impacts everything else that you're doing. So a really good business example here is Alcoa, and they're an international aluminium company. And a CEO that they had, Paul O'Neill, he came in the late 80s. And he said, hey, you know what? I'm not going to focus on profits. I'm going to focus on safety. And the shareholders all thought he was mad. He'd lost it. But that drive for safety did a number of things. And so what it did is, first of all, it began to improve the communication between the employees on the floor and management as to what was going on and how things could be improved. It then started to improve the communication between the factories, because one factory would say, hey, look, we found a way to use this machine in a much more efficient and far safer way. And they would pass that information on to the other factories. And then as that began to improve, morale also improved, standardization and efficiency improved, which ultimately led to more profits. And so that idea, that drive for safety, it had that knock-on impact, and it improved a lot of other things too. And it's like an analogy that I like is it's like skipping a stone across a pond, right, with a calm surface. Now it's the same stone, right? That's your keystone habit. It's the same stone skipping across the surface. But each time it touches, it's creating different ripples, right? And each ripple interacts with the one prior, and it grows and it grows. And be helpful is the same way, right? Because when you're helpful, you're someone who understands the problem at hand, and you know how to deliver the right solution when promised. And the reason that you're able to do that, right, is because you're organized. You follow through on promises made. You're intelligent. You speak intelligently in meetings. All of those kind of things. And why do you think like that? Well, you think like that and act like that because you consistently follow through on the answers, right, to those encouraging barrier questions. How can I encourage people, and what barriers do I need to remove? So another way to think of those three parts, right? People first, how can I encourage people? What barriers do I need to remove? And developing that keystone habit. A way to think of those three is like an arch. Now, an archway is one of the strongest building structures that's available, right? And if we think about it, remember like all of the arches that the Romans built, and they're still in existence, right? Thousands of years later. So the first part of our arch is our cornerstone. And in a masonry foundation, the cornerstone is the first block that's laid. And then every block laid after that uses that cornerstone for reference. So if that cornerstone isn't square to the foundation, or if it's not level, then the whole building's going to be off. Our second part to our arch, right, is our blocks and mortar. Now, our blocks give us height and distance, and the mortar glues everything together and gives us strength. And in this case, the mortar is our encourage and barrier questions, right? So how can I encourage people? What barriers do I need to remove? And then the blocks, they're the behaviors that we're developing when we follow through on the answers to those questions. And our third step here now is the keystone. And the keystone is really important, right? Because it's that angled stone right at the top of the arch, right in the middle. Because what this does, it locks everything together and provides the strength, right? Because as all of the forces are coming in from the side, they're all pressing against that keystone. Now, if that stone isn't there, sure, the archway is you can still build the archway, but it's not going to be as strong and it's not going to last as long. And the keystone for us here is our Be Helpful keystone habit. And what is that keystone habit? Well, that's where you're consistently, right, developing those positive behaviors because you're following through on the answers to those encouraging barrier questions. So as a recap, how do we solve the problems, the business problems that others can't? Well, first of all, you understand what your audience needs, you deliver it when you said you would, and you get them excited and using the solution. And how do you do that? Well, you build relationships. You keep your processes simple and effective, and you always deliver on your promises. Now, those things there you would have thought are straightforward and they're common sense, and they are, right? And the expectation is that everybody's doing that. But as we know from from those earlier statistics, that only 1 in 3 projects actually do this, right? People leading those projects are doing this. So for you to help you stand out, right, and to do something different, you do this, right? You take a people first approach. You ask the encourage barrier questions, and then you follow through on the answers, right? Following through here being perhaps the most important, right? Because it's one thing to ask the question. It's something completely different to follow through on it. And then everything that you do is driven by your Be Helpful keystone habit. And what does that lead to? Well, it leads to this, right? The end result, that people use you, your product or service, because they want to, and not because they have to. And here's the ultimate question. Well, why, right? Why do people want to use you? Okay, because you can solve the business problems that others can't.
I like the what barriers do I need to remove?
Yeah.
So the timing of that. Now, logically, the timing of that is first before you even do anything. Would you say that, or are you saying it's always probably live and fluid, in other words, responsive to what happens next? But what do you suggest as the timing goes? I mean, I don't think any project manager doesn't think of the people, but there's obviously, if it's only 36% of projects that actually have that successful result, that means there needs to be some, fluid movement of motion of responding to the needs. So what's your take on timing?
Timing of that, those questions are always going to crop up. Because like I said, they're very strategic and they're actionable. So they're the type of question that you can ask at the beginning. You're probably going to ask more of them at the beginning in the planning stage. And then you'll ask them again as you're perhaps getting towards the closing stage, and less in the middle. Because if you've planned everything, so you've got your plan A, your plan B, and even your plan C, then when you're getting into the execution part, if things start going off track, right, leaving plan A, well, you already know where to go to. You already know what encouragement you need to give to people, what barriers you need to remove, because you've gone through that big planning session right at the beginning. So yeah, I'd say you probably do more at the beginning and more at the end and less in the middle. But they're the type of question too where, and you mentioned this, Scotty, with that CAN report, right? The conditions, actions, and needs. You're not necessarily sitting down with someone and saying, hey, right, well, what are your conditions? So again, you're not necessarily sitting down with someone and saying, well, how can I encourage you to give me this? It's a way of thinking, it's a process. You can certainly ask the question and it's going to give you the answer that you want and that you need. But it also drives your way of thinking and then behaving, right? Because you're developing those good behaviors. So it becomes second nature for you to be thinking and acting in those ways.
Yeah, it's awesome. I'll ask if there's any questions in a second, but, in the 90s, I learned a term called business judo. But that was really what I was originally taught was mental judo. So you mentioned it. You gave a perfect example of it. So basically, by the time you'd finished that project, that you were talking about at the university, where you got, was it 95% of the data?
Yeah.
Managed to make people think it was them participating and them giving the information and them being involved.
Yes.
And the aluminium company, you said, did the same. So all of a sudden people got involved and started encouraging other people as if it was their decision. That's what mental gym is. How do you get people to buy into it? And almost like it's their idea, but it might have been yours, but how do you get people to want to do it on their own? And that's
absolutely. And that's that being that sort of hidden influencer. And for me, that's just a big part of building those working relationships and that collaboration, is that I'm not there to be the head of it, right? And to sort of be, right, to be the king with the scepter, and to take all the glory. I'm there to help everybody understand and see the benefit, right? To see that greater benefit. And like you said, and then to get the buy-in. So, right, people can then actually go, you know what? Yeah, I do like this idea. I do understand it. I am going to be a champion for it.
Yeah, I love it. So that's why I really like, what barriers do I need to remove? It just rung through for me. And
the barrier and the encourage questions, they, in some ways, they almost feel a little bit like the same, but they're really they're the opposite. Same coin, but both sides, right? But opposite sides of that same coin. Yeah. Because you can get slightly different answers out of it. So, for example, right, what barriers do I need to remove? Well, I shouldn't make my service so complicated. I shouldn't make my pricing structure so complicated. Because you can say, well, hey, how can I encourage people to buy my product or service? Well, I could have the awesome marketing, but if my pricing structure sucks, nobody's going to sign up. But if you remove that barrier, then people are going to come on board, right? You're going to increase their success. So you do get two different answers out of that.
Yeah,
from the two questions.
Any questions?
Paul, I wonder, in a lot of ways you're sort of preaching to the choir, because you may remember that I spent a good part of my career in the Canadian post-secondary system before going out on my own. And so when you were talking about being in that university environment and that feeling of being siloed, that was really resonating with me because I've been there. And so I was wondering, Scotty asked about timing, but I also wonder about organizational size and those feelings of being siloed. Does it make a difference? And is there something that you can do specifically to bring people on board when the organization is this huge bureaucratic environment that we know isn't going to turn around in a day? And so that's where timing comes into play. But where do you start, and how do you kind of build momentum when it's just so big that it seems beyond reach?
The great place to start, I've always had good success with, is starting with people that are champions either for you personally or champions for the idea or the department that you're a part of. So, for example, I've been a lot of my career in higher ed, we were in central IT. Now, there are three departments that are hated in university's life. Central IT is one, because all they ever say is, no, you can't do this. Internal audit and parking are the others. But there are some people who say, I get it, central IT, you're actually not too bad. I know what you're trying to do. Or, I'm really on board with a piece of software that you want to buy and integrate across the system. So starting with those people who are champions for you, because that's going to give you a couple of things. So first of all, one, that's going to build your confidence, right? So you don't feel like you're hitting your head against a brick wall. So it's going to give you the confidence. They're also going to give you insights into that tribal knowledge. So they're going to help you tweak your message if it needs to be tweaked. And then your champions are also they're also going to be able to help get the people who are resistant, to get them on board, right? Because they now become the intermediary. So you get someone who says, I don't like working with Paul. He works in central IT. He's got no clue what's going on. But we've got Sally over here in the College of Arts and Sciences. And Sally says, Paul knows his stuff. He's really good. And she's talking to Bob, right? And say, hey, Bob, this is okay. Because Bob respects Sally and he gets what Sally's saying, Bob's now going to come on board. And so starting with that champion, they're going to give you the confidence to grow. They're also going to tell you who to reach out to next. So it becomes this kind of, this ripple. So like you said, you're now growing across this large organization. It's starting to get visibility. You're also starting to get that positive message. And then when you do come across the detractors and those who are resistant to change, because you've got the moderators in the group, they're slowly coming on board. And so you do get this kind of ripple effect that grows. But like you said, it takes time, and particularly with a big organization that is resistant to change, like a university, it does take time. Yeah, you've got to get that momentum going.
Yeah, well said. So in wrapping up, so your 3 steps were people make the difference.
Yes.
Ask the 2 questions. How can I encourage people, and what barriers do I need to remove?
Yeah.
And lastly was to develop the keystone habit or habits.
Yes. Yeah. And what's critical about the keystone habit is it's a core habit that impacts everything else that you're doing. So for example, right, I mean, a good habit is to always be organized and to have pen and paper, right? Make sure that your pen is full, or right, go for a run in the morning, or don't eat too much chocolate, or don't bite your fingernails. But they don't really impact anything else. But that keystone habit, that's a positive driver that changes everything else that you're doing.
Well, I was going to ask for one more tip as you wrapped up, but you just did it.
Nice.
Well, that was a really good session. I really enjoyed that. So thanks everyone for coming. Keep an eye on System 1357 Live for more events coming up. We do have some webinars that we're about to announce, some extra webinars, some global ones, which is excellent. So there's a lot more coming up on the calendar. And obviously then watch the replay. So you'll be able to watch Paul's replay once again on System 1357 and other workshop replays from the past. So thanks everyone for coming. And any final thoughts, Paul, as we wrap up?
I think we're good.
You good? That was excellent, mate. Well done. So thanks everyone for coming. We'll see you all on another one.
Excellent. Hey, thanks everyone.